The temperature inside Everett Hale's cabin held steady at 68 degrees, while outside the Montana night dropped to 12 below zero. He had burned only 3 logs since sunset, while his nearest neighbor half a mile away was chopping his 5th armload of the day just to keep from freezing. Before we dive into how Everett discovered this impossible heating method, let us know where you're watching from, and if you appreciate stories of frontier innovation, hit that subscribe button because tomorrow's tale is even more remarkable. Griffin Walsh was dying, and Everett Hale couldn't understand why. The iron stove in the corner of their cabin glowed cherry red, so hot that standing within 3 feet of it was unbearable. Yet 20 feet away, where Griffin lay wrapped in every blanket they owned, frost still formed on the interior log walls. The temperature outside had dropped to 30 below zero 3 days ago and hadn't risen since. They had burned through what should have been 2 weeks' worth of firewood in 72 hours, and Griffin was still shivering so violently his teeth chattered loud enough to hear across the room. Everett fed another log into the stove, watching the metal sides pulse with heat. The stovepipe running up through the roof radiated warmth for the first 2 feet, then disappeared into the ceiling, carrying all that precious heat straight out into the January night. He pressed his hand against the log wall near the ceiling. It was cold. The heat was rising, concentrating near the roof, and escaping before it could warm the living space where they actually needed it. Griffin had stopped talking that morning. His lips were blue-tinged despite the roaring fire. Everett knelt beside him and pressed his hand to Griffin's forehead. His skin was cold and clammy. This wasn't right. A man shouldn't be freezing to death 10 feet from a fire hot enough to melt lead. The blizzard outside had trapped them for 3 days. The wind screamed through, gaps in the log chinking, and snow had drifted halfway up the door. They couldn't leave, couldn't get help, couldn't do anything but burn wood and watch Griffin slip away despite their best efforts. Everett had hauled that iron stove 200 miles into the mountains last summer, convinced it would be the solution to mountain winters. It had cost him $43 in street louis, nearly a quarter of his entire season's profit. It weighed 220 pounds and had taken him and Griffin 6 days of brutal labor to transport from the nearest trading post. And it was failing them when they needed it most. By the 4th morning, the blizzard broke. Everett managed to get Griffin onto his horse and down to a settlement 15 miles south where a missionary family took him in. Griffin survived, but barely. He spent 2 weeks recovering, and when he finally could speak normally again, the first thing he said was that he was done with mountain winters. He left for Oregon that spring and never came back. Everett returned to the cabin alone and stood in the center of the single room, studying the iron stove that had nearly killed his partner. The stove itself was fine. The problem was everything else. The problem was that they were trying to heat air, and air didn't hold heat. The moment you stopped feeding the fire, the warmth disappeared, sucked up the stovepipe and out into the sky. There had to be a better way. Everett Hale hadn't always been a mountain man. He was born in 1813 in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, the second son of a stonemason named Richard Hale, who built fireplaces for wealthy families along the Susquehanna River. While other boys learned farming or apprenticed to blacksmiths, Everett spent his childhood carrying stones and watching his father work. Richard Hale was obsessive about his craft. He tested every stone before using it, heating samples in his forge and timing how long they retained warmth. Everett remembered his father holding a heated stone in his bare hand, counting seconds before the heat became unbearable. Different stones behaved differently. Limestone heated quickly, but cooled quickly. Granite held heat longer, but took more time to warm through. Soapstone was the best, staying warm for hours, but it was rare and expensive. His father built massive fireplaces that weighed several tons, constructed with inner chambers and complex flue systems that captured heat before it could escape up the chimney. The wealthy didn't care about efficiency, but Richard did. He took pride in building fireplaces that heated entire homes with half the wood of conventional designs. He explained to young Everett how heat moved through stone, how thermal mass worked, how the right architecture could store warmth and release it slowly over time. Everett left Pennsylvania in 1833 at age 20, driven west by restlessness and the promise of fortune in the fur trade. His father had died the previous winter, and Everett had no interest in taking over the masonry business. He wanted wilderness, freedom, and adventure. He found all three in the Rocky Mountains, trapping beaver along cold streams and living in crude cabins that bore no resemblance to the sophisticated stone structures his father had built. For 3 years, Everett had ignored everything his father taught him. Mountain cabins used iron stoves or simple stone chimneys, and that was enough. Trappers didn't build elaborate fireplaces. They built shelters that kept the rain out and burned whatever wood was available. Heating was simple. Make fire, stay near fire, feed fire constantly. That was the frontier way. But watching Griffin nearly freeze had awakened something. Everett found himself thinking about his father's lessons for the first time in years. He remembered the massive fireplaces with their interior stone chambers, how they stayed warm long after the fire died. He remembered his father explaining that stone was a battery for heat, charging during the fire and discharging for hours afterward. The iron stove was the opposite of everything his father had taught. It heated air, which disappeared immediately. It had no thermal mass, no capacity to store warmth. It was efficient at creating heat, but terrible at keeping it. Everett realized that mountain men had embraced iron stoves because they were modern and convenient, but they had abandoned principles that actually worked better. His father had died, believing his son wasted his education chasing pelts in the wilderness. But now, standing alone in a freezing cabin, Everett understood that his childhood had prepared him to solve a problem that was killing men every winter. Everett spent the late winter of 1836 visiting every trapper's cabin within 20 miles of his own. He told men he was checking trap lines and looking for good beaver streams for the coming season, but his real purpose was studying how they heated their shelters and watching how those systems failed. Jasper Finch lived closest, just over the ridge to the east. His cabin used a stone chimney built directly into the back wall, constructed from river rocks mortared with mud. The chimney worked adequately when the fire burned hot, but Jasper had to feed it constantly. Everett watched him through an entire evening. Jasper added wood every 45 minutes, and each time he let the fire die down even slightly, cold crept back into the cabin within 20 minutes. The stone chimney itself stayed warm, but most of that heat radiated outside, warming the forest instead of the interior. 3 miles south, 2 brothers from Ohio had built matching cabins with iron stoves imported from St. Louis. The stoves were smaller than Everett's and cheaper. One had already cracked along the seam where the door attached, leaking smoke into the cabin whenever the fire burned too hot. The brothers had packed the crack with clay, but it was a temporary solution. The other stove worked fine but consumed wood at an alarming rate. The brothers spent 4 to 5 hours every day cutting and splitting firewood just to maintain heat through the long winter nights. Everett made careful mental calculations. A standard trapper burned approximately 4 cords of wood per winter, sometimes more during severe cold. Each cord represented days of labor cutting, hauling, splitting, and stacking. That time couldn't be spent running trap lines, processing pelts, or hunting for food. The inefficiency of frontier heating didn't just waste wood, it wasted the most valuable resource a mountain man had: time. He visited a French-Canadian trapper named Baptiste, who had built a cabin with both a chimney and an iron stove, thinking 2 heat sources would solve the problem. Instead, he burned twice as much wood, and the cabin was still cold. The 2 systems competed with each other, creating drafts that pulled cold air through gaps in the chinking. Baptiste planned to abandon the location and build somewhere else, convinced the site itself was cursed with bad winds. Everett saw the pattern clearly. Everyone was trying to heat air directly, either with iron or with open fires. Air was a terrible substance to heat because it moved constantly, rising up and escaping while cold air flowed in to replace it. The cabins were full of convection currents, endless cycles of heating and losing warmth. Men were fighting physics without understanding what they fought against. By late March, Everett had reached a conclusion. The solution wasn't better stoves or bigger chimneys. The solution was stopping trying to heat air at all. He needed to heat something that would hold warmth and release it slowly. He needed thermal mass. He needed stone. But not just any stone arrangement would work. It had to be engineered correctly. In April of 1836, Everett traveled to a mixed settlement along the Green River to sell his winter's consignor collection of pelts. The settlement consisted of a trading post, a small missionary station, and a loose collection of cabins where trappers, native families, and a few settlers coexisted in uneasy commerce. Everett had come for supplies and information about beaver populations upstream, but he found something far more valuable. An elderly Shoshone woman sat outside the trading post, weaving a basket from willow branches. Most white trappers ignored the native women, but Everett had noticed her watching him intently as he examined a poorly built stone fireplace attached to one of the settlement buildings. The fireplace smoked badly, and the stones were already cracking from improper construction. Everett had been studying it, trying to understand why it failed. The woman spoke to him in heavily accented English, startling him. She said he was looking at the stones wrong, that white men always built their fires wrong. Everett, curious, sat down nearby and asked what she meant. The woman set her basket aside and began to explain. Her people, she said, had lived in this country for more generations than could be counted. They had survived winters far colder than anything white trappers complained about, and they had done it without iron stoves or massive wood consumption. They used stone, but not the way white men used it. White men built walls around fire and let the heat escape upward. Her people built pits that captured heat and held it inside stone itself. She described fire pits lined with carefully selected rocks, burned hot during evening, then covered with flat stones and earth once the fire died. The stones would radiate heat all night, warming the shelter without any flame at all. She explained how they chose stones from riverbeds, testing them first by heating and cooling to ensure they wouldn't crack. Certain stones were better than others. Dense, smooth river rocks that had been underwater for many seasons were best. Light stones, or stones with cracks, inside would explode when heated. Using her hands, she showed him the circular design, 2 rings of stones with space between them. The inner ring faced the fire directly. The outer ring absorbed heat from the inner stones and released it slowly. The gap between rings protected the outer stones from cracking while creating an insulation layer that held warmth longer. Most white men, she said, thought native peoples were primitive because they didn't use iron or build tall structures. But her people understood heat better than whites did. They worked with fire's nature instead of fighting it. They didn't try to hold flames all night. They captured the fire's gift in stone and let the stone do the work of warming. Everett listened carefully, asking questions about depth, stone size, and burning time. The woman answered patiently, seeming pleased that at least one white man was willing to learn. When he left the settlement 3 days later, he carried more than supplies. He carried knowledge that would change everything. Everett returned to his cabin in late April with a plan that most trappers would have called insane. Spring was the season for trapping beaver, when pelts were thick and valuable. Instead, Everett spent his days walking along the riverbed 5 miles from his cabin, studying stones. He wasn't looking for just any rocks. He needed large, flat stones that were dense enough to hold heat, but stable enough not to crack under extreme temperature changes. The Shoshone woman had warned him that many stones contained hidden moisture or fracture lines that would cause them to explode when heated rapidly. Choosing wrong could mean starting over, or worse, having a stone shatter and send fragments through his cabin like musket balls. Everett developed a testing method. He would select a stone, carry it back to his cabin, and heat it in his existing stove fire. He would bring it to high temperature, then plunge it into cold creek water. Stones that cracked or split during this thermal shock were rejected. Stones that survived were candidates. This process was slow and exhausting. Each stone weighed between 30 and 60 pounds, and the 5-mile round trip to the riverbed took most of a day. By mid-May, he had collected 17 stones that passed his testing. He needed at least 40 for the design he envisioned. His trap lines sat empty. His spring trapping season was effectively finished before it started. He was gambling his entire year's income on an untested heating system that everyone else would think was madness. Griffin's replacement, a young trapper named Marcus, arrived in June expecting to partner for the summer season. He took one look at the pile of stones outside Everett's cabin and asked what they were for. When Everett explained his plan to build a circular stone fire pit inside the cabin to replace the iron stove, Marcus left the same day. He wanted no part of what he called Indian foolishness. Everett worked alone. By late July, he had collected 43 acceptable stones. He began construction in early August, giving himself 3 months before serious cold arrived. He started by removing the iron stove entirely, creating open floor space in the center of the cabin. The stove had sat near the wall. Everett's pit would occupy the center of the room, radiating heat in all directions instead of primarily toward one side. He dug a shallow circular depression in the dirt floor, approximately 4 feet in diameter. The depression was only 6 inches deep, just enough to provide a stable base and create a proper draft channel underneath the fire. He lined this base with smaller stones, creating a foundation layer that would distribute weight and allow air to flow beneath the burning wood. Then came the critical work, building the 2-layer circular wall system. The inner ring would face the fire directly. The outer ring would absorb and store the heat. Between them, a carefully calculated gap that would serve as both insulation and structural support. Everything depended on getting these proportions exactly right. Everett's first attempt at stacking the inner ring failed within 2 days. He had placed the stones too tightly together, leaving no room for expansion. When he built his first test fire, the rapid heating caused the stones to expand against each other. By the second day, 3 stones had developed stress fractures. He had to dismantle the entire inner ring and start over. The lesson was clear: stone needed room to move. He rebuilt the inner ring with small gaps between each stone, approximately ½ inch of space. These gaps would allow for thermal expansion while still maintaining structural integrity. He used small stone chips as spacers, carefully positioning each large stone so it rested stable but not pressed tight against its neighbors. The inner ring consisted of 12 stones, each standing vertically on edge to create a circular wall roughly 18 inches tall. Everett had chosen this height through calculation based on his father's fireplace work. 18 inches was deep enough to contain fire and create a proper combustion chamber, but not so deep that adding wood or managing the fire would be difficult. The interior diameter was approximately 24 inches, large enough to burn standard firewood lengths, but small enough to concentrate heat efficiently. Building the outer ring presented a different challenge. These stones needed to be larger and thicker because their job was thermal storage, not direct fire contact. Everett selected his densest stones for this outer ring, pieces that weighed 50 to 70 pounds each. He positioned them in a circle around the inner ring, leaving a 3-inch gap between the 2 layers. That gap was critical. Too narrow, and heat would transfer too quickly from inner to outer stones, risking cracks in the outer ring. Too wide, and the outer stones wouldn't absorb enough heat to be effective. 3 inches was the compromise Everett calculated based on his father's techniques with fireplace chambers. The gap would fill with hot air during burning, creating a convection current that would heat the outer stones gradually rather than shocking them with direct flame contact. The outer ring required 15 stones to complete the circle. When finished, the entire structure stood 18 inches tall, with an outer diameter of approximately 4 feet. The top edges of both rings were roughly level, creating a circular opening through which Everett could feed wood and tend the fire. The total weight of the structure was over 1,200 pounds of stone, all of it sitting on his cabin floor. Everett built supports underneath by laying flat stones across the base to distribute the weight across a wider area of the dirt floor. He couldn't risk the entire structure settling unevenly or sinking into the ground over time. The foundation layer extended 6 inches, beyond the outer ring in all directions, creating a stable platform. The construction had taken 3 weeks. Now came the moment of truth. Would the design actually work, or had he wasted his entire summer building an elaborate failure? Everett gathered kindling and prepared for the first real test fire. The first snow fell on November 3, 1836. Everett had been testing his stone pit for 2 months, learning its behavior through autumn's gradually cooling temperatures. He had discovered that the stones took approximately 3 hours to fully charge with heat, requiring a hot, sustained fire during that period. But once charged, they radiated warmth for 8 to 10 hours after the flames died completely. Jasper Finch chose the worst possible night to visit. December 7th brought a cold front that dropped temperatures from 20 degrees at sunset to 15 below zero by midnight. Jasper arrived at Everett's door just after dark, ostensibly checking on his neighbor, but clearly curious about the stone pit he had heard described by passing trappers. Jasper stood in the doorway, staring at the circular stone structure in the center of Everett's cabin. He asked if Everett had lost his mind, building what looked like an Indian fire pit inside a perfectly good cabin. He pointed out that Everett had removed a $43 iron stove to build something that belonged outside. Everett said nothing, just invited Jasper to stay and observe. At sunset, Everett lit the fire. He used dry pine for kindling, then added 4 split logs of seasoned oak arranged in a cross pattern inside the stone chamber. The flames caught quickly, burning bright and hot in the deep pit. The stones began absorbing heat immediately. Jasper stood near his usual spot by the wall, arms crossed, skeptical. After 1 hour, the cabin's temperature had risen noticeably. The stones glowed with stored heat, visible even in the gaps between them. Jasper admitted it was warming up, but pointed out that his iron stove did the same thing. Everett nodded and waited. 2 hours after lighting, Everett added 2 more logs. The fire burned intensely, flames rising a foot above the stone rim. The cabin was now genuinely warm, comfortable, despite the plummeting exterior temperature. Jasper's skepticism was fading. He had moved closer to the pit, holding his hands over the stones. The radiant heat was remarkable. 3 hours after lighting, Everett let the fire die. He added no more wood. The flames consumed the last logs and faded to coals, then to nothing. Jasper looked confused, asking why Everett was letting the fire go out. The night was just beginning, temperatures still dropping. Everett told him to wait and watch. By midnight, Jasper's confusion had turned to astonishment. 6 hours had passed since the fire died completely. The cabin remained warm. Jasper pressed his hand against the outer ring stones. They were still hot enough that he could only touch them for a few seconds. The heat radiating from the stone mass was substantial, steady, unchanging. Jasper spent that night in Everett's cabin. Neither man tended a fire. Neither man added wood. Everett slept soundly through the night. When dawn came and they stepped outside into the bitter morning, Jasper looked at the stone pit with new understanding. He asked Everett how to build one. Jasper Finch returned to his own cabin, convinced he would eventually build a stone pit, but not immediately. His iron stove worked well enough, and building a pit would require weeks of labor during winter when every day counted for survival. He told himself he would attempt it next summer. That decision nearly killed him. January 18, 1837, brought the worst cold snap Everett had experienced in 4 years of mountain winters. The temperature dropped to 30 below zero and stayed there for 6 consecutive days. The air itself felt dangerous, burning exposed skin within minutes. Simple tasks, like gathering water from the creek, became life-threatening expeditions. Everett's stone pit performed flawlessly. He burned fires twice daily, morning and evening, letting the stones charge for 3 hours each time. Between fires, the thermal mass kept his cabin at a steady 55 to 60 degrees. He was comfortable, safe, and burning approximately 1/5 the wood he would have needed with his old iron stove. Jasper was not faring as well. His iron stove, pushed to maximum output for days, developed a critical failure on the 4th day of extreme cold. The constant expansion and contraction from intense heating and cooling created a crack along the seam where the firebox joined the base. The crack was only an inch long initially, but it leaked smoke directly into the cabin. Jasper tried sealing it with clay, but the extreme heat kept breaking the seal. By the 5th day, smoke filled his cabin whenever he burned hot enough to generate real warmth. He faced an impossible choice: freeze with a small fire that didn't smoke, or suffocate with a large fire that did. He chose to freeze. On the 6th day, desperate and half-frozen, Jasper made his way to Everett's cabin. The journey of half a mile in 30 below temperatures left him shaking and disoriented. When Everett opened his door, Jasper stumbled inside expecting to find similar crisis. Instead, he found comfortable warmth and no active fire. The stone pit sat cold, flames long extinguished, yet heat radiated from the stones as if the fire still burned. Jasper stayed 3 days while the cold snap persisted. During that time, he observed everything with the attention of a man whose life depended on understanding. He watched Everett's morning routine: build fire at dawn, tend it for 3 hours, let it die completely. The cabin stayed warm until evening. Evening routine: build fire at sunset, tend it for 3 hours, let it die. The cabin stayed warm through the night. Jasper did. Calculations. Everett burned approximately 6 logs per day total. Jasper had been burning 30 logs per day with his iron stove before it cracked. The mathematics were undeniable. The stone pit used less than 1/4 the wood while providing superior, more consistent heat. When the cold snap finally broke and Jasper returned to his own cabin, he didn't repair his iron stove. Instead, he began collecting stones from the riverbed. By February, he was building his own circular thermal mass fire pit, following Everett's design exactly. Emmett Ridge was a traveling trapper, the kind of man who spent summers working different territories and winters moving between cabins, trading stories and information across the scattered mountain community. He arrived at Everett's cabin in late February 1837, expecting the usual hospitality: shared food, whiskey, and conversation in exchange for news from other camps. What he found instead changed the trajectory of frontier heating technology for the next 2 decades. Emmett entered the cabin and immediately noticed 2 things. First, the interior was remarkably warm despite no visible fire. Second, there was a massive circular stone structure occupying the center of the floor where most men kept their stoves. Everett explained the system while Emmett examined the construction with intense interest. Unlike most trappers who dismissed new ideas as unnecessary complications, Emmett recognized innovation when he saw it. He stayed 2 weeks, watching Everett's routine and asking detailed questions about stone selection, construction technique, and thermal performance. Everett shared everything freely. He had no interest in keeping secrets. The knowledge was useful, and useful knowledge should spread. Emmett took careful mental notes of every detail, from the 3-inch gap between stone rings to the 18-inch chamber depth. When Emmett left in March, he carried the complete design in his memory. Over the next year, he visited 17 different trapping camps across Montana and Wyoming territories. At each stop, he described Everett's stone pit and its remarkable efficiency. Most trappers were skeptical initially, but Emmett was persuasive. He described the mathematics: 70% less wood for equal or better heat. For men who spent 1/4 of their time gathering firewood, that number was impossible to ignore. By winter of 1838, 11 trappers had built variations of Everett's design. Some modifications emerged naturally. A trapper named Morrison added a flat stone cap that could be placed over the pit opening after the fire died, trapping even more heat inside the stone mass. Another trapper named Chen, who had experience with Chinese construction, suggested using smaller stones mixed with clay to fill the gaps in the outer ring, creating additional thermal mass. Jacob Stillwater, a settler who had built a permanent homestead in the foothills, adapted the permanent homestead design for a larger family dwelling. He built a pit 6 feet in diameter with 3 concentric stone rings instead of 2. His version could heat a cabin twice the size of a trapper's shelter and could go 12 hours between fires, even in extreme cold. The winter of 1839 tested every heating system in the mountains. It was brutally cold, starting early and lasting late. Several trappers with traditional iron stoves ran out of firewood by February and had to abandon their cabins temporarily to survive. Every man with a stone pit made it through the winter with wood to spare. The practical proof was absolute. By 1840, the stone pit design had spread throughout the northern Rockies, carried by word of mouth and demonstrated by simple survival. Everett Hale left the Rocky Mountains in the spring of 1845. He was 32 years old, had survived 11 winters in conditions that killed stronger men, and had accumulated enough money to start a different life. The fur trade was collapsing anyway. Beaver populations had been trapped nearly to extinction, and silk hats had replaced felt in Eastern fashion, destroying the market that had created the mountain man era. He traveled to Oregon Territory and purchased land in the Willamette Valley. He married Agnes Whitman, a schoolteacher's daughter, in 1846. They built a house, raised cattle, and started a family. Everett never returned to the mountains, but the mountains never forgot what he had built there. His abandoned cabin stood empty for 3 years before a prospector named William Hatch discovered it in 1848. The logs were weathered but solid. The roof still kept out rain. And in the center of the single room sat the circular stone pit, exactly as Everett had left it. Hatch moved in immediately, recognizing the value of the heating system. He lived there for 2 winters before moving on, and after him came others. The cabin exchanged occupants. Every few years, each one benefiting from the thermal mass heating that required a fraction of the wood any other system demanded. By the 1850s, engineers and builders in settled territories began studying frontier heating methods. A surveyor named Thomas Kellerman documented several stone pit designs in 1857, including detailed measurements and thermal performance observations. His report noted that cabins with properly built stone pits maintained comfortable temperatures with 60 to 70% less fuel consumption compared to iron stoves or traditional fireplaces. The physics Everett had intuited through necessity were now being validated through measurement and calculation. The phrase, "built like a hail pit," entered the vernacular of frontier construction, used by builders to signify heating systems designed for maximum efficiency with minimum fuel. Settlers moving west specifically sought information about the technique. Military forts in remote territories adopted variations of the design for their guard stations and outbuildings. Everett lived to see this validation. In 1872, a traveling journalist researching frontier innovation tracked him down on his Oregon ranch. The journalist had heard stories about the mountain man who revolutionized cabin heating and wanted to interview the inventor. Everett, now 59 years old and far removed from his trapping days, was surprised anyone remembered. He spent an afternoon describing the stone pit design, the principles behind it, and the Shoshone woman whose knowledge had guided his work. The journalist's article appeared in several Western newspapers that fall. Everett received letters from builders and homesteaders asking for additional details. He answered what he could, though by then the technique had evolved beyond his original design in ways he barely recognized. Everett Hale died in 1886, surrounded by family who knew him only as a cattle rancher. But in the mountains where he had spent his youth, stone pits still radiated heat through winter nights, silent monuments to the moment when necessity, observation, and frontier ingenuity combined to solve an impossible problem.